Good afternoon, welcome back to TADHack Global 2017. We're based here in Brisbane at QUT, sponsored by QUT Foundry and Oracle. So I'm happy to have as a guest Dr. Monique Mann. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
So you're from the School of Justice, which is a little bit different coming from, I suppose this is a application development hackathon. All right, so not necessarily one of those times that we get to speak to people outside of the IT or engineering space, so glad that you can join us here. In terms of telecommunications, and very relevant in terms, and why we even reached out is that there's a lot of things when people talk about the communications and cloud, Internet of Things, as we sort of had spoken before with Marissa, there's a lot of challenges just from the law and justice perspective. So just give me a brief introduction in terms of some of the things you do in terms of your research and what you're interested in.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm certainly interested in looking at some of these issues in relation to telecommunications surveillance, particularly from a law enforcement and government perspective. And I was very inspired to kind of go into this area and start doing research in this area as a consequence of some of the Snowden revelations and other issues that we've seen in relation to programs of state-sponsored surveillance and really large-scale blanket and indiscriminate surveillance of individuals and their communications. So this is something that is very important from a legal perspective, from a justice perspective, from a privacy perspective, and also certainly other human rights. This is very much kind of a fast-moving field, so there's a real risk and potential for our rights and freedoms to be kind of eroded in a cyberspace environment that it's very fast-moving, and we see a range of different developments, and most recently here in Australia, for example, debates and discussions around mandating or building backdoors into encrypted telecommunications applications.
So as you say, it's a fast-moving pace, and it's not necessarily an area that I'm an expert in. So I would say though, traditionally a developer, and security and those kind of concerns is something that I'm quickly needing to come up to speed. We probably see a lot of things from a financials industry, that there's APRA and those kind of regulations. So what do you see in terms of communications and smart devices? Internet of Things sort of came up in discussion yesterday, and drones. So we had Trumbull Unmanned on before when they talked about drones with their cameras and the network. There's a lot of things that we need to consider when we come to surveillance and privacy.
Certainly, and this is really an area in which the Australian legislative framework is really kind of lagging behind. I mean, looking internationally, there are a number of sort of treaties and human rights instruments that do kind of set out the importance and protection for freedoms and rights, particularly that of privacy. But here in Australia, there are some really significant governance gaps in a lot of these areas. So we don't have any constitutional protection of human or privacy rights here in Australia. There are also very significant carve-outs in the Australian Privacy Act for law enforcement and security and intelligence agencies also. And there's a lot to be said as well in relation to sort of transparency, accountability and oversight in a lot of these surveillance practices as they relate to telecommunications.
So it's very easy for businesses to say, okay, there's this new shiny little marble that we need for our business, and as like what Marissa said before, is like the security side, and then the regulations side becomes almost an afterthought. Do you see businesses really engaging and understanding what their risks really are?
I think there is much greater attention, particularly from a commercial perspective, being paid at some of the risks as they relate to things such as information security and data breaches, for example. So we've seen a series of very kind of high-profile data breaches that have been publicised, and also here in Australia we've recently seen the introduction of mandatory data breach notification legislation, which does place obligations on businesses to report these types of events. So certainly that this is something from a business and commercial perspective that a lot more attention is being paid to.
So what is happening in that space in terms of, call it committees, organisations that is coming together to actually understand what the right model is in terms of surveillance model and privacy?
Well, I'm not really sure if there is something like a right model in these sorts of areas, my involvement particularly is that in civil society. So I'm involved in a number of civil society groups, that of the Australian Privacy Foundation and also Digital Rights Watch Australia, but there are also others, and we really kind of advocate and lobby for sort of meaningful reform and change in these areas. In terms of kind of what we see more broadly and internationally, there are a number of other very interested groups, particularly that of Privacy International, they've been quite successful in mounting a series of challenges in relation to state surveillance programs.
So, coming from Oracle, then what do you think would be a technology vendor's responsibility in terms of making sure that that we actually help and contribute to making sure that things are safe and information is safe?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I think also this kind of links into the issue that I mentioned previously in relation to some of the proposed developments in relation to building backdoors into encrypted forms of communication and telecommunications applications. I think it's really important for the private sector and industry groups, whether they be Oracle but also Facebook, WhatsApp and so forth, to really kind of mount some resistance to these sorts of kind of attempts from government. I also think in terms of probably more of a broader information security kind of perspective, we see things like the development or the identification and sale and trading in things such as zero-day exploits and other software vulnerabilities that are being stockpiled by governments. And I think that there's a lot to be done by private organisations in particular working in this area to ensure that communications applications are secure, they don't have backdoors in them, and we're actively trying to kind of patch and address vulnerabilities in these systems.
So that's probably more from the technology side. How do we work in terms of describing what law, what I suppose the governing bodies that actually do enforcement of these policies, and actually how do we contribute to those areas as well?
I think events like this are really important as well, and I also think in terms of contributing to things like submissions for certain inquiries or debate, and that's certainly what we try and do in organisations such as the Privacy Foundation, is really lobby kind of key decision makers and bring public attention to these sorts of issues, and also the potential consequences of them in a way that kind of highlights the impacts for individuals and society at large.
So one of the notes that you sent to me earlier, you mentioned an organisation, Five Eyes Alliance. What is that? It's not a name that I've heard before.
Really?
No.
No. And did you follow any of the Snowden revelations in relation to?
I think I saw some stuff, but it wasn't necessarily front of mind. It was like front page type things I saw.
Okay.
Great. I knew what was happening, but I didn't really dive into that.
Okay, well, much. I would suggest then that you kind of watch the documentary Citizen 4, but also the Oliver Stone adaptation, Hollywood-style adaptation of these events in the film Snowden. But to answer your question, the Five Eyes Alliance is a very comprehensive intelligence alliance between Five Eyes partners, which is Australia, the United States, Canada, UK and New Zealand, and essentially this kind of intelligence partnership is very comprehensive and involved in sort of the sharing of information. So this also kind of enables it to the Five Eyes partners to sort of circumvent sort of domestic limits on spying on their own citizens. So they spy on each other's citizens and then exchange this information. So a lot of attention was particularly brought to the Five Eyes intelligence partnership as a consequence of Snowden's revelations, and what this showed was programs such as the PRISM program, which involved really kind of the complicity of tech companies, enabling the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance to really kind of tap into their systems to collect telecommunications information around the world, but also other programs of surveillance such as the Tempora program, which involved largely the GCHQ, intercepting undersea fibre optic cables across the world, or essentially the infrastructure or backbone of the internet, to intercept everyone's communications. I think it's also important to note that Snowden's revelations now are 2013, and I'm sure that there's a lot of other stuff that's happened since that we're perhaps not aware of or don't really know about. And I think on that point it's really important to emphasise that this is a very opaque area. There are a lot of secrecy provisions, particularly those of intelligence agencies, and there's kind of a real limit and lack of kind of accountability and transparency, in my view, in a lot of these practices. And they are really coming to light through whistleblowers and disclosures being made, and then also some of the cases that we've seen being kind of led by civil society groups such as Privacy International.
Yeah, so when you actually get those global organisations, that actually then translates into, okay, what is international law? What is national law in terms of how do you actually translate something that goes across those bounds?
Well, I mean, certainly things like privacy are recognised as I've said, in human rights kind of instruments such as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and also Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the EU, there's the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights, and a lot of these kind of cases of kind of mass indiscriminate surveillance, particularly in the EU and in the UK, while it remains in the EU in any case. Brexit is a different issue. Yep. We've seen these kind of programs be challenged, and quite successfully. So in the EU, for example, there was the Data Retention Directive, which was actually thrown out as being found to be representing an disproportionate interference with individual privacy. In Australia, however, and I found this incredibly disappointing, and I know a number of my colleagues kind of in law and justice and also in civil society did as well, we actually saw these types of kind of blanket and indiscriminate surveillance being actually legalised and introduced in the form of mandatory metadata retention legislation, which requires internet service providers to retain metadata about individual communications for a period of 24 months. However, my prediction in this area is that there'll be moves to kind of extend the retention period perhaps indefinitely, which is very problematic. So my point in this is that Australia is really kind of out of step with what we've seen in terms of some of the responses to the disclosure of this kind of information. Australia has kind of gone the opposite way and actually formally introduced and legalised kind of these types of developments.
So it's a brave new world what happens in that period of time when there's potentially more cases or that misinformation or how that metadata is actually used. So I'm not sure where to take that conversation, but I suppose one of the things that would bring it back into even some of the things that they're doing next door, we did raise this whole autonomous vehicle type conversation when we last caught up. And where we're actually dealing with a lot of the technologies, it's not just one organisation that is actually responsible. There's many different organisations come into that one vehicle, doing the software, doing the firmware on different parts. Even the mechanics, the mechatronics, actually what they do is traditionally not one vendor. So it becomes an interesting story when you talk about law enforcement and incidences and the roles and responsibilities that we have cross organisations.
And that raises very interesting points in relation to issues of legal liability as well. And this certainly relates to some of other areas of research work that I'm kind of involved in relation to robotics and so forth. So there are real questions in relation to, if something goes wrong with an autonomous vehicle, for example, who is responsible? Is it the person who programmed the vehicle? Is it the person, who sold it and so forth? So there are real kind of unresolved questions here. On that note, though, we are kind of starting to see moves towards, the recognition of some of the serious issues in this area. And for example, Germany only just very recently actually implemented sort of ethical standards in relation to sort of autonomous vehicles in particular. And there are also attempts, if we look at the areas around computerized decision making and algorithmic justice, essentially, there are also attempts, particularly by the IEEE, to develop and implement ethical kind of standards for the the use of these systems. You also raised a very interesting point in relation to so many things coming together, and I think that this is very significant when we start to think about not only the integration of numerous data sources, also the analysis of this, but also the integration of a number of different technologies. So another area that I'm particularly interested in is that of biometrics, and I've done quite a lot of work, particularly in the area of automated facial recognition technology. And I find this very interesting because we have this technology that enables the identification of a person in physical space through things such as CCTV and other forms of surveillance, but then also the linking or the extraction of their biometric information in the form of facial templates, but also the linking of that information to other information that's out there about them, and that could potentially be, in government data sets, but also we talk about private companies, in social media and so forth. So this actually enables kind of vast and very kind of large and ever-expanding data sets to really be brought together, and then on top of that we're introducing sort of, automated analysis and algorithmic profiling on top of that, bringing in information around people's political views, perhaps their sexuality, their income, in order to make some sort of decisions, and more often than not to target advertising and other things at them. More seriously though, like when we think about this in the context of elections and so forth, we see companies such as Cambridge Analytica are profiling sort of populations for the purposes of targeting certain political messages at them. I mean, I think there's a real risk here for the fundamental sort of freedoms that come with a democratic society, and I think that this is something that we should be very mindful of.
And as we become more connected in terms of not just as people, but as social profiles, as even just the simple tweets here and there, that kind of concept, then all that can be brought together in terms of that profile, and then from that, what's the implications of those?
Well, we're certainly seeing kind of government attempts to actually do this. So we see the Digital Transformations Agency, for example, trying to introduce a single unique digital identifier for all individuals in order to interact with government systems and services. And I think when we kind of cast our minds to kind of events such as Robodebt, the Robodebt data matching kind of debacle between the ATO and Centrelink, we can start to see sort of what some of the consequences of bringing this in, all of this information together is. And I think fundamentally there's kind of a real risk here of individuals losing, I should say, their own autonomy and control over their personal information and data, and that's really quite serious in terms of, how individual personal information is being used or collected, analysed and used, and what extent people actually have to consent to this is, I think, questionable, and also opt out. And this also becomes very relevant when we think about smart cities developments and other IoT kind of devices as well.
I've actually got a personal story from the Hacking Health event that I mentored, similar to Angela. And one of the teams I actually worked with was actually the PHN, so North, based around Lutwyche. And they actually had a My Story. That was the name of the project. And it was all about getting that person, whether someone of addiction or mental health, that control of that information and the interpretation of the information of that. Because once you get into metadata, then how you interpret that data is your prerogative. It's not the person that owned it. So there's that terminology, that translation that may not necessarily happen. So it's actually very important that the real essence of that story is actually maintained by that person and for the intent of that information.
And we certainly see sort of debates or discussions in privacy sort of really shifting from a narrative of privacy to more concepts such as information self-determination and also kind of individual autonomy and control over their personal information and how that's actually used. Certainly there's a lot of work to be done kind of in this area, and that's really kind of what inspires me and what drives me to get up in the morning. So I've got some other projects that have actually just recently been funded in relation to sort of developing sort of ethical frameworks for the collection and use of data, and trying to really kind of move the focus away from sort of this critique to actually sort of proposing some solutions in how we kind of move forward with the view and consideration of all of the developments that we see, whether they be online, whether they be through IoT, whether they be through smart cities, and also government information systems also.
So it sounds like we've got a lot of work to do.
Oh yeah, I'm certainly very busy.
So thank you, Dr. Monique, for joining us on the couch here.
No, thank you for
QET.
having me.
It was great chatting to you, and we'll have a chat later.
All right,
Thank
excellent.
you.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Up and